I'm very pleased to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure to even be on the same stand with people that I've known and whose work I've admired for many years. I was telling Manny that he was my boss. He was very surprised by that. So we amended that he was the head of the division I was in, and we agreed that was a better factual description. I want to spend half an hour, and I want to spend it about half negative and about half positive. My personality and instincts, among those who know me, would be to spend about 25 negative, 5 positive, but I'm going to try and restrain that and push myself to, at 4 o'clock precisely, shift to a positive modality. But life is full of serendipity and chance events, and I just happened to come down on a shuttle today from Boston and bumped into a friend of mine who's president of a large technology company. And I started explaining to him what I was going to talk about, and he said, "Oh, we have something exactly similar in our field. Here, I'll send you a slide." So literally as we flew, when he got to the, well, not as we flew because we all turned our devices off, just after we landed, he sent me this slide. And this is the Emerging Technologies Hype Cycle. And what it does is it tries to classify various things that people are talking about in terms of a cycle that's common in the technology field. There's a technology trigger. Something becomes possible, and people start talking about the possibilities of it. There's a peak of inflated expectations in which everyone's talking about it, and the one happens to be highlighted as big data. How many people have heard the phrase big data? How many people have any idea what it means? Other than it's data and it's big. So it's like progressing in the hype cycle. It's headed for the peak of inflated expectations. Then there's a trough of disillusionment. I love these. It's like Middle Earth in The Hobbit or something, you know. The peak of inflated expectations. This is consultants are good at this. This is the trough of disillusionment, in which people realize that the hype was like supremely overblown, right? Its real potential is something, and then some things survive into the slope of enlightenment, right? In which let's reconcile ourselves to realistic with what this is going to be, into the plateau of productivity. It becomes routine, right? Now, my claim today is that the RCT fad is right here. It's at the peak of inflated expectations, been around long enough that we're about to head into the trough of disillusionment. Because we've now been doing it for long enough that if it were like going to radically pay off, we kind of should have some really good examples of it really radically paying off. And instead what we have is lots of talk about learning how to use RCTs more productively, and about how, well, we never really expected these to do precisely what it would claim they would do, right? That's what happens in here. And then when I get at 4 o'clock, I'm going to start talking about here, right? How do we take what we have learned from the boom and bust cycle and move it into a slope of enlightenment about how we really can incorporate learning of a variety of types into greater development effectiveness. So I only got this slide this morning, so I was going to use this slide, which is this is housing prices in Las Vegas. Fortunately, most of you don't live in Las Vegas, and it wasn't. But there are kind of three sides, and it has the same sort of, not as sophisticated as that, but same sort of, there's a period in which the only question is, how can I not get in on this, right? I'm the ADB, I'm the IDB, I'm the World Bank. It's so hot. It's hot, hot, hot. How can I not get in on this? I mean, after all, like, I'm a professional economist, and my brother-in-law's a dentist is making a fortune buying and selling real estate in Las Vegas. How can I not? Like, I'm smarter than him. How can I not get in on this? There's this, like, peak where people say, uh-oh. Las Vegas is situated on a large plain. There's no supply constraint. in housing in Las Vegas, which means the long-run price of housing in Las Vegas has to be the marginal cost of construction. And this is not the marginal cost of construction, right? And at this stage, the people who have bought into this boom start to say more and more ridiculous things. So, if you watched, who's that guy that rings the bell on CNBC about stocks? The Jim, what?
Cramer.
Yeah, Jim Cramer. Like right before the crisis, he was just saying ludicrously stupid things about the sustaining of what was obviously at that point increasingly looked like a bubble. But since if you're invested in the bubble, the last thing you want to admit is that it's a bubble, because you're bought in. If you owned a house in Las Vegas, at this stage you were at your coffee clutches with your neighbors talking about why this was the true equilibrium value of houses in Las Vegas. And that it's peaked, but it's going to plateau. Right? And you all kind of know in your heart of hearts, nah. And then afterwards, it's what were they thinking? What were they thinking to have bought houses in Las Vegas, right? Lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera. So there were two lines of argumentation for RCTs. One was a line of argumentation which has to, and I live in two worlds. I have managed bank projects. I've actually taken a World Bank project to the board and been task manager of a bank project. And at the same time, I sometimes write papers. So I kind of move back and forth between two worlds, and there's two different sets of argumentation. One was that the RCTs were a good way to do research. That if we were doing research, the main problem that bedeviled economics as an empirical endeavor was that we can only generate non-experimental data, which is driven by the endogenous choices of agents, and so eking back out causal parameters or structural parameters or causal infacts from non-experimental data is really difficult, because we're observing a very complex system operating, and where each element of the system is a human being or firm who is making choices in response to the events and things they observe, so it's very hard to say what was cause and effect. Do people have higher wages when because they go to school because they know they'll get higher wages, or because exogenously schooling will produce higher wages? So the causality questions. And so then eventually, this, through kind of weird processes, it got to be that the claim is that only experiments, or as good as experiments, could produce what was called rigorous evidence. Okay? Now there's a second set of arguments which are more interesting to this crowd, which is devoting time, attention, resources, skills, capabilities of organizations to RCTs will actually improve the welfare of human being in the world. Now notice that these two arguments needn't have anything to do with each other. You can easily write an empirical paper that could publish in a journal that no one ever reads, that never has any impact on anyone, which is in fact true of most empirical papers, which I can say here but don't usually say there. The median citations of a paper published in economics is 0. So, okay. But this is a much more complicated claim, because I have a student in the room. At least one? More than one? Okay. So what we drill into them is that any claim about a development project has to be based on a complete, coherent causal chain from the action you propose to the outcome you desire, including a correct positive model of the behavior of every agent in the chain. All that says is, if you're going to say, I'm going to do X and Y is going to be the result, you have to answer a whole series of why questions. Oh, well, if you do this, why will they do that? That's a positive model of the agents, right? If I, pay teachers more money, I'll get better qualified teachers. Well, why? Well, because we think teachers are motivated by higher pay. Okay. So let me just talk briefly about these two things. I'm going to kind of bracket the academic side for a second, but just want to reassure you that even on the academic side, they're completely wrong. The advocates of RCTs are completely, totally wrong, even where you think they might be right. Right? We're going to talk about the fact that they're wrong about how the world really works, but that's not that surprising. They're academics. Why would they know how the world works? But they're wrong about the science. They're deeply wrong about the science, and I'm only going to give one of the many possible reasons, right? And that is that the external validity problem is worse than you can possibly imagine. So what's the external validity problem? The external validity problem is I'm going to do an experiment about whether providing an additional teacher to a classroom improves student test scores, right? Now, I'm going to do that experiment in a particular way, in a particular place. So one of the most famous experiments in this field is done in Tennessee, long-term experiment about reducing class size. And we know for sure from this rigorous thing, we know for sure what the estimate of student learning on students in Tennessee is from reducing class sizes from 20 to 13 in the way that they did it. Great. Now, I have the stupidest possible OLS regression between test scores and class size in Kenya. And I want to make a decision about the effectiveness of reducing class sizes in Kenya. Which is more rigorous evidence? First of all, there's no way to know. Right? It may well be, and in a paper that I have just published, or at least a working paper that's out with Justin Sandifor of Center for Global Development, we show that for the most part, for the field that I know best, which is about impact on learning of students, the contextual variation is orders of magnitude larger than the methodological variation. Which means you're almost certainly to be better off with a contextually relevant stupid estimate than a sophisticated estimate from another context. Okay? And it's worse than that. How is it worse than that? And this is a little complex, but I think once you kind of see it, okay. The idea is that doing RCTs is going to provide us a body of rigorous evidence on which policymakers can draw, and it's going to be rigorous evidence, okay? But the problem is that without claims to external validity, how do I weight rigorous and non-rigorous evidence? So let's take a field, and we have lots of estimates from OLS, the simplest possible technology, of the impact of class size on student learning. And what we know about those estimates is they have a large distribution. Some are negative, some are zero, some are small but positive, and some are very big. So we have a distribution. Okay? Now we do an RCT, and we have an estimate, right, of causally identified impact of class size on learning. Okay? Now, the problem is, let's say we break the world up into two parameters. We have a causal impact parameter, right? But the reason we think OLS is biased is because we have a causal model of the world in which agents act in ways to cause our OLS to be biased. Otherwise, OLS would be an experiment. So let's say we have a bias-causing parameter, right? Okay, we've got all these OLS estimates. We do one RCT, and it falls in the middle of our OLS estimates. What do? What's our belief? Well, you could say, well, let's just trust the RCT estimate. But wait a second. We have two sets of parameters because there's external validity. Well, wait a second. If there's external validity of the causal impact parameter, and I'm going to believe in all these contexts where I have an OLS estimate, they were really wrong. They all should have been the impact parameter I now have estimated. What are you saying? You're saying that the causal parameters about the world that cause the bias are heterogeneous. This is like an incoherent view of the world. It's an incoherent view of the world to assert there's external validity of a causal impact parameter, but there's heterogeneity in the bias-causing parameters. Because it's like a reasonable claim to say they're both the same. It's a reasonable claim to say they're both heterogeneous, but it's a really unreasonable way to characterize the models that generate the observations we observe in the world, that they just so happen to be such that there's complete heterogeneity in the bias-causing parameters, such that when I do in one context an impact parameter, they just so happen to align so that I really should collapse my priors onto the causal impact parameter. I can see I'm losing everyone. In particular you, maybe more than others. But The basic point is simple. There is no logically coherent way to claim there's external validity. It's not just implausible that there's external validity, it's scientifically impossible that there's external validity, given what we know about the heterogeneity of the non-experimental estimates. We can't reconcile heterogeneous OLS estimates with RCTs. Full stop, right? This is, now, second little point I'm going to make, and then I'm going to move on, because at 4 o'clock I'm going to get positive. No, I'm not. Wow, shoo. Okay, let's skip that then. Okay, so the second thing is, let's move from the academic. I'm just reassuring you that even on the sort of debates about science and what science really looks like, the RCT people are out on a complete limb. Complete limb. It's nothing science about it. It's alchemy, right? Doing experiments is not the hallmark of science. Otherwise, alchemists would have departments at universities. Because they did lots of experiments, right? And astronomers wouldn't, right? So doing lots of experiments doesn't make you a scientist. Second point, though, let's move to, would it be the case that allocating more of my available development resources towards rigorous controlled trials of development projects is likely going to lead to greater development effectiveness? Okay? Here I think the RCT claims are wrong. No, that was one too many wrongs. 4 wrongs. Just 4, right? In that, they're wrong about how development effectiveness is produced in every conceivable way. So my claim is the way in which impact evaluation was done at the World Bank before the beginning of the RCT fad was better for development effectiveness than the RCT fad. The RCT fad has been positive retrogression in the extent to which learning from evaluations improves development practice, because their causal model of how one moves from evaluation to development effectiveness is wrong on 4 levels. First level, right, is that really development is about national development and only secondarily about policies, and national development things are more or less impervious to the techniques of RCTs. So I have some graphs I'm going to skip from a paper with Charles Kenny that just came out a few months ago, but basically we show kind of what you all know, is that everything works really well in Denmark and nothing works really well in Afghanistan, and getting Afghanistan from Afghanistan to Denmark is all of it, and all of absolute deprivation in every conceivable way disappears if you just have development, right? And development just basically isn't caused by the kinds of things that are amenable to RCT kind of trials, but is amenable potentially to the kind of things donors are able to do. And so any attempt to reduce what donors do to what can be rigorously evaluated is a huge mistake, right? And any attempt to reduce evaluation to only what can be measured in a concrete way is a huge mistake. So I'm skipping some slides, okay. But I do want to emphasize that, the field that we're in of development has actually been one of the most wildly successful fields ever. I don't know why we're always playing defense. It's like, what's not to be proud of? End of colonialism, spread of democracy, massive reductions in poverty, reductions in child mortality by 2/3 since the if we look at the development endeavor as an endeavor in which the international actors have engaged in since the 60s, this is the most wildly successful period in the history of man by an order of magnitude. Who's on the defensive about development? The idea that we're on defensive about development is like being defensive about the following statement. There is no, I'm going to make a statement that's true and completely ludicrous at the same time, right? There's no rigorous evidence that Martin Luther King had any impact on civil rights in America. I think that's unassailably true, because I use the word rigorous. What's the rigorous evidence that Martin Luther King had anything to do with it? Sure, you can tell stories about Martin Luther King and marches on D.C. and stuff, but no, where's our rigorous evidence? At the same time, it's completely ludicrous. Martin Luther King was there. Civil rights unambiguously happened in a massively, spectacularly successful way. Like, who's going to be defensive about having, if you had donated in any way, shape, or form to the success of Martin Luther King, and I came to you now and said, you don't have any rigorous evidence that money was successful, you would do that. You would go, you're kidding, right? That's a goofy line of argumentation. We succeeded! Why are you bugging me? Okay. So, and if you look at recent successes, we have all kinds of successes out there. And the main point is none of them have anything to do with variations in the extent to which randomized controlled trials were used. So you would think if I were producing evidence that RCTs were going to be good for development, I'd have some evidence that RCTs were good for development, and I'd have like a development success and say, well, here's a big success. And by the way, this was like crucially essential, right? And the closest we get to that are, well, we don't get anywhere close to that, right? The closest we get to that is people will cite CCTs. And we can talk about CCTs and what really happened there. I'd be hesitant to do that because Santiago's in the room, but that's the kind of closest we get. Okay, so second, so the first way in which it's wrong is it just is on the wrong instruments, right? We really should be focused on the big picture of national development as development actors, and focusing on the big picture means we're focused on systematic changes, and if we're focused on systematic changes, we can't possibly generate RCTs. And to stop working on the systematic issues because we can't do an RCT would be foolishness of the first order. Second, the RCT crowd has no coherent, positive model, model of how reforms actually happen, in which they could make any plausible claim that RCTs were essential to it. So they just don't have a model that is at all plausible in describing the actual world, in which the advent of more rigorous evidence makes a huge difference. You can have models in which people will use rigorous evidence to accomplish their objectives in combination with lots of other things, but the idea that per se rigorous evidence is an important causal driver of the behavior of policymakers or the adoption of policy reforms is just wildly at odds with simple common sense. And I have papers in which I go beyond simple common sense and use economics and say, what would be our economic hypotheses about the way the world would look if it were in fact the case that the binding constraint to doing better were rigorous evidence, and the world just doesn't look that way. For instance, if really moving the efficiency frontier were the key constraint, we should be at the efficiency frontier. Right? But if we're not at the efficiency frontier, then already we can't have a positive model being at the efficiency frontier constrained only by the frontier. It's just incoherent. Okay. And this slide, I've been told that I shouldn't have slides that say one thing and say others. Not that they're contradictory, just that you can't multitask, but I'm assuming you're multitasking and reading the slides. So the third way in which the RCT is wrong is it's wrong about how organizations actually build capability. So if we were worried about, so there's two different things to worry about. One is what's the policy, and the other is what's the organization's capability to implement the policy. And so kind of what RCTs have been about, or are a lot of the time about, are what policy should my organization adopt? Now a policy is a mapping from, it tells agents what they should do, right? So if we think of like a post office, right? A postman has a scripted routine. He gets a package, he looks at the address, he looks at the postage, and he knows from that script what to do. And so it has policies of how you handle various packages, and that's a policy. But you have to have capability for policy implementation in that the agents of your organization in fact have to do, as a matter of fact, what the policy does. The main problem in the weaker parts of the world is not necessarily that we have the wrong policies, but that the organizations don't have the capability to implement the policy. So I have lots of examples, but these colleagues did a study of delivering the mail, where they mailed mail to the wrong address and see if it came back. And regulations, the policy is, it's supposed to come back, right? And so they mailed 10 letters and said, how long does it take for these misaddressed letters to be returned to sender as the policy dictates in every country that they should? And the answer is in about 35 countries of the world, none of the letters ever came back. Okay. Now, should we change post office policies? Maybe. But since the actions of the agency and the organization now are not well predicted by the existing policy, it's kind of an extraordinary claim to believe that if we change the policy, it would change their behaviors. Might be true, right? But it probably isn't true. Let me give you another quick example. Another quick example is, again, colleagues did a study of getting a driver's license in India, where they found basically what my driver in India knew, that if you pay the tout, you don't have to take the driver's test. And when I described the study to my driver, he was infinitely amused and a little bit concerned that these famous MIT professors could make a living at this. They could have asked me. So let's say we have, now the policy was that you had to take the driver's test. It's just the de facto reality was the agents of the organization responsible for giving the driver's license weren't following the policy. Now let's say I come in and I did an RCT because I found that lots of accidents were caused by people turning left when they shouldn't have turned left. And so I introduce into the driver's license exam that you're legally mandated to take that you have to demonstrate to the examiner that you know how to turn left properly. And I do an RCT in a country where they implement policy and find that that reduces crashes associated with left turns. My conclusion is they should do that in India? Well, they're not giving the test. So what you add to it or don't subtract from it doesn't matter. So if we wanted to have a theory in which RCTs made things better, we'd have to have a theory in which it changed not just policy but practice. Right? Now mostly what we're learning is two things from the RCTs. First, we're learning that lots of the RCTs are failing to produce results about the impact of the policy because they can't implement the policy in the RCT. So with all the goodwill, all of the effort, all of the attention, they can't implement what they're trying to implement in order to see what impact it would have. So the lessons from that for policy are like, well... Secondly, what we're learning, what we have now just learned, is that the only available rigorous evidence about the impact of rigorous evidence is that it doesn't work. So, researchers went out, did a perfectly rigorous randomized controlled trial of the impact of contract teachers, in which they controlled the implementation through an NGO. And they discovered that if you put a contract teacher in a classroom in Kenya, scores went up, and if you put in a civil service teacher, scores didn't go up. Clean result, nice T statistics, going to get published in a good journal, I'm sure. Okay. So, these second set of researchers came and said, let's make policy based on this rigorous evidence. Sorry about the fingers, but I can't help it. What did they find? Well, they found that when the Ministry of Education was responsible of implementation for exactly the same policy, it had no effect on student learning at all. Okay. Anybody in the room who's over 40 and worked on development, this should come as no surprise at all. Because implementation is a key constraint, and the ability and capability of organizations to do implementation is a key constraint. So, fourth thing, and boy, I'm skipping some slides. So, the fourth thing is they're wrong about how people learn, right? And in particular, they're wrong about how people learn, and that leads to changes in their behavior, right? And I summarize this in the phrase, you can't beat a turtle to move. So their model of learning is that I learn and you change your behavior. Right? I do an RCT about what the best practices for teachers are. I tell the teachers what these best practices are, and they do them. That's the goofiest model of how people learn and change their behavior I've ever heard. I know for one, I'm maybe on a spectrum of individuals, but I know for one But like, I've never changed my behavior because anybody told me to do anything, right? I learn when I learn, which means if I'm engaged in the process of learning such that I see for myself more or less, then I kind of change my behavior, right? So, you know, and most dysfunctional organizations that have persisted because they have a very hard shell, right? So the idea that RCTs are going to be the stick that's big enough to get through the hard shell that the World Bank has around its own dysfunction is really surreal, right? So to the extent there's functionality in the bank, it's because many people inside the bank want the bank to succeed and stick their neck out and make it succeed. But to external attacks, it's got a very hard shell, right? So the idea that we're going to make the World Bank a better place by forcing World Bank staff to follow rigorous evidence that's been demonstrated elsewhere, rather than we're going to convince World Bank staff, and I'm talking about the World Bank because I'm at the IDB. If I were at the World Bank, I'd talk about the IDB. The idea that we're going to change World Bank staff behavior by presenting them with hard, incontrovertible evidence about how their behavior should change is just surreal. Surreal. We're going to have to convince them, which means to convince them, we have to imagine that we're going to engage them in a process in which they feel they have actually been a legitimate part of a legitimate learning process, which characterizes, by the way, the evaluation processes that the World Bank had at the OED and IEG before the fad, which is there was a community of practice in education, and if you were going to evaluate education projects, you had a senior person who'd been working at the bank in education for 20 years, bring together people to talk about what we're learning from evaluation in a way that, by the time that was produced, there was some consensus that we should change our behavior because we had participated in the process of producing the learning to which we were intended to respond, right? And the idea that that is vastly enhanced by the rigor of evidence, I think, is, again, just not a correct theory. So, I lied. I will admit, I was going to get positive at 4. It's 4:13. I'm just, so. Now I'm going to get positive, which is, if we're worried about development effectiveness, we have to say two things. One, we have to say we, as development actors, have been the most wildly successful human movement for human progress in the history of man. We have been successful, wildly successful, right? We're like civil rights on steroids, man. The world is a much better place for there having been the development movement and the development organizations within that movement. So we're going to have to pivot our own efforts towards a more sophisticated learning model because the scope for gains of doing logistical things in logistical ways is over. So I've just written a book about schooling, which I encourage you all to buy, in which it basically shows that every kid is now in school and roughly every kid stays in school until primary school is over, and many much longer. But the degree of learning is small. The same approaches, techniques, and learning modalities that led us to universal enrollment will not lead us to universal education, right? So we have to think, what's our learning model that's going to take us there? And I'm going to say two things. One is, I'm working with colleagues on developing an approach to organizational capability. We start from the premise that we're going to get to good, strong organizations by encouraging the organizations to solve problems in ways that doesn't presume that we have a solution to start with. So it's what we call problem-driven iterative adaptation, which is we want the organization to nominate a problem that they're concerned with solving, so rather than start with a solution orientation, start with a problem orientation. I want to reduce crime. There's a million ways to reduce crime. Which of the ones are the ones that my organization undertake? We want to improve learning. There's a million ways to improve learning. Let's talk about what those ways would be. Then we want to sort of think through the project in that term of inputs to impacts, right? And then we want to use monitoring, which is M, experiential learning, which is little e, and big E, impact evaluation, as a set of strategies that the organization will learn to dynamically guide its behavior towards the solution of its problem. Right? So this is the opposite of solution-driven achievements, where we assume we know the solution and the problem is getting people to adopt it, fund it, and scale it, and we don't know it, right? Which means we want to use lots of what we call little e, which is experimentation, for more rigorous experiential learning. Now, the thing about more rigorous experiential learning is that it's going to have to be incredibly orders of magnitude cheaper than impact evaluation. So the reason the impact evaluation boom is going to collapse into a trough of disillusionment is that we're spending $2.5 million to evaluate $200,000 initiatives when we have no claims to external validity. That's crazy. You can't do a cost-benefit analysis and justify an impact evaluation without claims to external validity. But we can never have claims to external validity, particularly in the second-generation problems that we have in development. So the little e experiential learning builds into the organizational capability building feedback loops during the project implementation period. So we need a flexible ex-ante structure that can allow the organization to work together with its partners to search to what we call crawl the design space, to try out and find out what's working in terms of validating or invalidating the variety of potential causal chains that exist between inputs and outcomes. So, and here's a 7-step process. This is all in a paper called It's All About Me, which has a nice catchy title, which my wife pointed out was one of the first honest titles I had ever had. So in the paper we go through kind of how we would think about what organizations do differently if we acknowledge ex ante that not only are we changing how we're learning, we're changing how we're doing to make learning while doing possible. Because if we continue the same ways of doing, innovations in the learning won't work. So the real problem with the big donor organizations is not the way they're learning. It's the way they're doing. And they have to change the way they're doing and the way they're learning simultaneously in order for evaluation of all types to work together. So the next generation of evaluation has to balance the role of evaluation as an instrument of fiduciary accountability with being an instrument of providing practitioners space to learn. And we have to acknowledge that those are in tension. To the extent that these evaluation units are seen as the external police of did you follow and comply with processes, and were you compliant with the project as designed, they will be counterproductive because they will discourage precisely the spirit of experimentation that we need for the second generation problems, to the extent that evaluators are seen as your friends in helping you do what you're trying to do more effectively by helping you structure a process of rigorous experiential learning rather than merely rigorous impact evaluation. The next generation of impact evaluation will contribute to the next generation of development effectiveness. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, Mike, that helps. Thank you. Well, I must say I've learned two things this afternoon already. One is that you never know what Lant is going to say, and he will not ever tell you before he says it. It's always interesting. And number two, that I think he missed his calling. He really is as good, if not better, than Jay Leno and David Letterman. Sorry, Lant, but you could have made many millions of dollars in another profession. But anyway, it was fascinating, certainly challenging, certainly daring to be that challenging in this environment, but much appreciated. And I have to throw all the questions out the door that we had thought we would talk about, and we're going to change, because we have obviously representatives from 3 organizations here who have been very energetic at pushing impact evaluation, and I dare say RCTs. Also, of course, all of us are in organizations that may be doing projects wrong, doing evaluation wrong. I mean, I think Lant has challenged all of us. So what I'd like to do to start is just give the panel a chance to react and to comment on what they've heard. And then we'll go on to some specifics about the organizations. But I think it's important first to get some immediate reactions. Maybe, shall I start with you, Santiago, given that, we're here in IDP,
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Cheryl, for the invitation. You want me to speak from here? Yeah.
That's fine, either one.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Lant, for a very provocative talk. Various reactions. I'll sort of mix my reactions to Lant's talk with what I think is the evaluation problem. There's a premise here that evaluation, implicit, not quite, I'm being unfair, but just to go to the other extreme. There's a premise that the only evaluation valid is RCT, and therefore it's overblown. Now, I've done some RCTs myself, and I actually do think that there's been too much of a hype. I think that they're overblown. I think that the academic debate has been pushed beyond sort of diminishing returns. And I think that partly is because some of the people that have been pushing RCTs have made claims that are perhaps too far. If you say the only rigorous evidence that I can accept to test a hypothesis is the one that comes from a randomized controlled trial, and everything else that doesn't come from that is not evidence that I can accept, I think that statement, in my perspective, is pushing it way too far. There's certainly many other ways of learning, many other ways of gathering evidence, and many other ways of understanding processes that, when combined with results from randomized controls, the whole set of information can provide you a view as to whether something that is being done makes sense or doesn't make sense. So in Spanish we have a lovely phrase, it's kind of difficult to translate to English, ni muy muy ni tan tan, which is a way of saying, neither one extreme nor the other extreme. The extreme of the people who say that's the only rigorous evidence that can ever be accepted, which is a fact in the academic papers, and all this identification thing, which I agree with Lant, is overblown and overdone, and unless something is perfectly identified, it's not valid, it's not rigorous, I think is gone too far. And if the curve is exactly as you put on your first slide, Lant, and it sort of comes back and there'll be a throw, I'm happy with that, and then we'll meet somewhere in I forgot the name of the positive slope, the hope, what was it called?
Plateau?
The plateau of hope or something like that. And we'll converge there, and that'll be a sensible thing to do. There. The slope of enlightenment. So maybe there'll be a couple of years in which there'll be this throw of disillusionment. I'm happy with that because I think it was overblown. And if we meet in the slope of enlightenment and there's a plateau of productivity, and somewhere in the middle, ni muy muy ni tan tan, somewhere in the middle, things are used with a sensible thing, I think that's the place to go. Lant raises a really important point, which I think really matters from the point of view of the development bank, which is the point of external validity. Which is one that really matters from the point of view of the development. So the question is, what do you do with the result of an impact evaluation when that impact evaluation is based on a randomized control? Do you say, look, I have a program in Peru in which this happened with teachers, and therefore, on the basis of that program in Peru, I will tell the government of Bolivia that that is exactly the way to do it, and it's the only way they can do it? I fully agree with Lant's point that you can't do that. That doesn't mean that you can tell the Bolivian authorities, look, in Peru, when they did this, this happened. You might want to take that into account when you design your own program. It's useful information. On the other hand, it also turns out in Paraguay, they also did the same as something different happened. And we think we understand partly why in some cases it did work and partly it doesn't, but we don't have a full situation. Now, that's useful to Bolivians, I think. You don't come with a recipe of exactly what you do. The Bolivians can then take that and say, all right, well, we'll experiment a little bit, maybe we'll tweak a little bit what they did in Peru, we'll try to change it a little bit, and we'll learn a little bit from the Paraguay, we'll tweak it a little bit more, and then we'll do it ourselves. And I think it behooves the Bolivian government, which is now, without the constraint of external validity that Lant properly points out, it behooves the Bolivian government to say, look, if I'm going to put a lot of money into this program, I'd like to know what happened. And I do want to evaluate it. How? There are many methods of doing it. Among them, I can do a randomized control, will provide some information, but clearly I should not only do that. When we did Progresa in Mexico, Progresa, to my surprise, took more of a, was more of a, big show more than I expected. I never thought it was going to be like that. We did the randomized control because we did not know back then whether what we were going to do was working or not, and we just wanted to know. And we wanted to do it in parallel to operational evaluations and a whole set of other evaluations that did not receive as much academic interest, but were equally useful in terms of the policy dialogue within the government as to what actually was being done. So I want to separate between the academic debate as to whether RCTs is the only way to go and is the only way of producing rigorous evidence, on which I would agree with most of what Lant said, from the policy usefulness for organizations like the IDB in our dialogue with countries as to, among the various tools that you want to use in your dialogue with countries, and among the various techniques that you want to engage with, do you want to use, in some cases, not always, RCTs as part of the tool that you want to deploy? And the answer to that would be yes, at least in my view. Always? No. Lant makes a really interesting point. If somebody's spending, I don't know, the example he said, $2 million to evaluate a program that is $200,000, yeah, that person would be fired. On the other hand, take a program that is going to be, again, the example of Progresa for Mexico. You're spending $5 billion a year over the last 10 years. So you spent $50 billion on that program. Is it worth to spend $20 million evaluating something in which you're going to put $50 billion? You certainly want to know, if I'm going to spend $50 billion, does that make sense or not? Now, that doesn't mean that every single program should be evaluated, but I think that big programs that are going to take a lot of money, half a percentage of the total cost of the program, to put some evaluation, and again, not all necessarily RCT, but other complementary evaluations of the program, does make sense because you want to know whether in fact it's working or not. So my position is kind of sort of agnostic in the middle. I use it. I don't deny that other methods of gathering information about what works and what doesn't work are not equally useful or equally valid. I put a lot of faith in theory and a lot of faith in what sort of common sense. What do I expect this program to do? But then I want to test whether in fact this actually happened or didn't happen. And you want to gather numbers. I think we should not equate the academic debate about RCTs with the policy debate, is evaluation useful? I think evaluation is essential. You might want to use RCTs, but you probably want to use other techniques. But evaluating what you're doing is important. It's important in preparing projects because it gives some discipline to the people that are preparing the project in terms of what you expect this project to deliver. It also is an act of honesty with the government that you're indebting to get some money from the multilateral organization as to say, look, we think this project will deliver this, but we need to measure whether in fact this is going to happen. That doesn't mean extrapolating to other countries, extrapolating to other situations. Again, the external validity point that was made earlier is really important. So where do I come out from this? I come out very much sort of in the middle, I would say. If the academic debate disinflates and we go through this trough of disillusionment and academic journals begin to receive more papers in which there's not all that discussion about identification, and unless there's an RCT, we won't accept your paper for publication, I think that'll be all to the good. Because I write papers also where there's no identification, and I write papers where I do simulation models, so I'll be all to the good. From the policy perspective, I think the FAD also needs to be pondered a little bit, but the pendulum should not the other way, as these tools will not yield any useful information for policy. properly used and combined with other tools, I think they can be part of the useful set of tools that we can use. I'll come there and I'll give some
Thank you.
space to
Thank you very much, Santiago. Let me turn to Jack, and I'd like to ask you also, I introduced you right before you came in, and I mentioned that the MCC has been a real prime user and one of the earliest really strong users of impact evaluation. And so you have some experience now of trying to do these, how much they cost, the cost issue came up, some of the questions of external validity, of how people learn, of how we do projects. Maybe you could bring in a little bit of your experience. I know because Jack talked once to another unit I had, and he was very candid and open about the positives as well as the negatives. So I would encourage you to really, react to what Lant said, but also very much from your own experience.
Thank you. This is a great opportunity. I am going to flash back about 20 years or so to a conference that I went to. We were presenting a paper evaluating determinants of fertility, and my co-author, Paul Gertler, as we were going into this AA session, said, let me give you a warning. We're going to be going up in a session with Lant Pritchett. This guy is really smart. He's going to be trouble. And I want to say, for exactly that reason, Lant really has been a lot of trouble.
Thank you.
For very good reasons, no. And this setup is perfect because I think more than any other major organization, MCC has really staked its claim on doing impact evaluations on the things that we do. We've got roughly 40% of our portfolio which is being subjected to impact evaluations. Before I came to MCC, I spent about 3 years working at the Water and Sanitation Program in the World Bank, where we were able to run, there was a series of, I think, very useful impact evaluations of some sanitation and hygiene programs. And one of the more revealing details going between the bank and then into MCC is if you think the costs of impact evaluations in the World Bank are expensive, stay out of MCC. Costs increased 3- to 4-fold for relatively similar impact evaluations, largely because of the way that we do it. So I think costs are a very important issue, and it's something that there are structural reasons it happens. MCC contracts the entire impact evaluation within the World Bank. The impact evaluations were largely funded out of the operations side. A very large portion of what went into the operations side. So we were paying for data collection, but really the managing these things in the field were different. So, but that's a way to say that this 3- to 4-fold difference in costs of impact evaluations may slightly overstate the real cost, but these things are quite expensive. I will try to throw out a little quick defense, which is we have none of our impact evaluations that cost more than the programs they're evaluating. Yet. We're still young. Cheryl gave me a number of questions. The first one came up with, in the last 10 years, what have you learned? Well, we're not yet 10 years old. So I would like to say that in another year or two, maybe I'll be able to answer all of these questions. What are we learning out of this? I hate to say it, but I really wish Lant had really guided us in some of these insights 3 or 4 years ago. You went looking around for your students here and didn't find many. I think a large portion of them are over at MCC. I think I can count 6 of them that have come through. And before I came here, I did have Cheryl's questions, but I realized that I was going to have to deal with, once again, one of these really clever insights, which is what you have previously called the little e evaluation, which is this me, the e in me. And your classmates, your students who are now in MCC have been looking really hard for opportunities to use evaluations to to improve the implementation of the programs, to sort of bring things out. The concept stuck. We've got a challenge, though, and part of the challenge, and it's part of the difference between the way that these evaluations are done at MCC and the way that they're done at the World Bank, and I think the way they're done at the IDB, though please correct me. Our evaluations are managed by the M&E group, and we try to work very closely with our sector folks, but we answer to a different boss. And to a certain extent, especially the first few cohorts of evaluations from MCC were introduced with a notion that you could overlay an evaluation on a program and just let the program do what it was doing, and we will measure the outcomes. Don't worry about it, you guys implementing the program. We're just here to count how many farmers get wealthier. And the results that we got out of a first wave of a half a dozen farmer training programs that we rolled out last year were pretty alarming. I think that the best characterization is the only cases where we learned anything were where the evaluators said, no, you can't do it that way. We've got to embed ourselves into the program and understand the functioning of the program. And I think that's really true. There were a couple of evaluations where this notion of sitting to the outside and randomizing treatments and controls and asserting that we would be able to determine cost effectiveness, they just didn't work. I mean, I don't want to say that they can never work. In certain situations, they might. But they really, I'm afraid you're too smart for me on this one.
No, I was just, one of my favorite stories is I went out to visit a randomized evaluation, and the the person there from JPAL doing the evaluation was introduced to me by the head of the NGO doing the project as, this is Dan, he makes sure we don't help any kids. Meaning, he was protecting the integrity of the experiment, right? By not letting them change what they're doing from the plan. That's the opposite of what your people are learning, is they're like, no, I can't stand by and watch this not work.
Yep. So that's, I think that there has been, certainly in the first wave of evaluations, one of the things that happened that is extremely useful, though probably a lot more expensive than it should have been, was to convince the folks on our operations side that the evaluations really were there to help them and not to reprimand them to demonstrate that they were abject failures. And at least in the agricultural sector, what we have found is they now, as they're developing the programs, are starting to ask precisely the types of questions that the little e evaluation should be asking as we go into the projects. If there need to be 7 different components to this farmer training and irrigation project, can we get some sense of which of these are really essential and which ones are less important? These were the sorts of questions that they finally started. We were asking it early on. The M&E folks were asking it early on. And it's only been in the agricultural sector that they've started asking, and I've got to admit, much smarter questions about the programs than the ones that we were trying to say, why don't you ask, why don't you ask? So that was one thing. But I want to make another quick, as if this were a quick point, I want to make one other point, which is really important to, I think, some of the challenges that we have doing evaluations. And it grows out of this great observation that Marcus Goldstein makes when he's doing his introduction to impact evaluations. He makes this observation that there are 2 types of people in the world. There are those who know and those who don't know. Excuse me, I said that wrong. There are those who know and those who know that they don't. And stepping away from our agricultural colleagues, who I think have really started to embrace this idea of learning what works as you're implementing. I think a number of our operations folks are caught in a really awkward position when faced with an evaluation, trying to learn, in which the evaluation is trying to learn what works. And that difficult situation I would characterize as operations folks who have been hired because of their capability to make projects work. They get brought into an institution, they get given responsibility over hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment, and they're given not only that responsibility, they're given this real sense of accountability that if these hundreds of millions of dollars are not spent well and effectively, it's really sitting on you. Their job is to work with country counterparts to produce a program that will work. That's their job. And then we come along and we say, we want to find out why your program doesn't work. Can you tell us why it's not going to work? And they've just spent the last 2 years developing a program convincing everybody around them that, yes, it is going to work. And we're now saying, now unpack it and tell us why it won't work. And I think it puts them in a very difficult position. The rare thing, and they do, and we find them, the rare thing is the implementer who can get something in the field that works, but really wants to know how to do it better. Lant's work in education, I think, really lays this issue bare, where there are people who know enough about what they're doing to say, this has got to be done better, and let's start working on how to do it. I think education, perhaps more than most sectors, has really been good at that. But we do have to work with this challenge that folks on the operations side are very often selected for their confidence that they can deliver something that works. And getting somebody who has been selected for that capacity to then question whether or not they're doing it right, I think is a tall order. But I think those are the sorts of people we need to look for.
Now I want to turn to Manny, who has been, his unit has been evaluating all of the World Bank's impact evaluation work over the last few years. And as you probably know, the World Bank has put a lot of resources to doing dozens and dozens of impact evaluations in your projects. So maybe you can give us a summary of kind of what you found with, especially...
First of all, let me say I'm speaking on my behalf, not on behalf of IE. Here, I have to say that. The second is, you must all be wondering, how can this guy not know that Lant worked for him? Well, after having heard him, you can imagine my confusion. Like all creative people, it's always a challenge to know whether these creative people work for you or you actually work for them. And I think Lant was immensely successful in confusing me for all the years that we worked well together. But I can always say it was always fun. I just want to make four points. One is to address Cheryl's question, and then I really want to ask Lant three questions about his fascinating paper. One is, if you had any doubts that the World Bank was not still approaching the peak of inflated expectations about impact evaluations, let me just give you some figures that we found in this wonderful report from which I was recused, because I was, in fact, at the time being evaluated for some of the work that's here. From 94 to 2004, the bank was doing about 16 IEs, impact evaluations, a year. From 2005 to 2010, it was up to 62 a year. And so the World Bank now has about, in the past 10 years, 460 impact evaluations that have been initiated over the past 10 years. And it's growing. Now, what proportion is that of bank projects? It's about 10% over that time period. So it's not 100% by any means, but it is growing. So if you believe what Lant has to say, you might be worried that in fact there might be room for this to grow, and that this might be a concern in the future. And it is, I think people are beginning to ask questions, I think the right ones, similar to the ones that Lant has pointed out, especially on external validity. But let me now get to the three questions that I have for Lant on his wonderful paper. One is that, is it really impact evaluations that have caused should be the driver of this concern about external validity? As I recall, and Lant, we were together in the bank when the bank was being castigated by many for having a one-size-fits-all. This was well before any impact evaluations. This was pre-2000, okay? So when we were doing about 5 a year. So my question then is it better to make this fabulous leaps of faith that we as development practitioners tend to make based on more rigorous evidence or on OLS estimations that might have been mindless? And I say mindless because I caught myself, like Santiago and Jack, we've all done these OLS regressions. And in fact, Lance, I recall in your paper with Justin, one of your straw men in your paper that said, here are some OLS regressions that were, so should we say, methodologically suspect, but in fact are no more wrong than the IEs, was one paper that I had.
Anyway, so my first point is that isn't it the case that external validity is a concern because we as development practitioners need to have solutions that are handy, and that we've been doing this for a long time, and would in fact going to perhaps fewer IEs actually resolve this, and my guess is that's just an innate sense that we have as development practitioners. The other is, the second point that I'd like to make, and is that maybe it's not a question, Lant, it's more of a comment, and that's building on what Santiago said, that even if you address these concerns about if you share these concerns about external validity and these leaps of faith, that impact evaluations are still useful. And one example is what Santiago mentioned, that in fact the policy, let me give you an example, and because I think Santiago was a bit too modest, having been the if not the father, the grandfather of Progressa and the conditional cash transfer program, and what impact that's had in the world. And in Asia, in East Asia, where I was working before moving to IEG, there was no social protection mechanism. The best social protection mechanism in most of East Asia was economic growth, but the crises have enabled us to have a conversation about how to get good social protection mechanisms. And one of the things that we in the bank did was brought, and this is from where I'm from, the Philippines, brought the Filipinos over to a conference in Istanbul in 2007 on conditional cash transfer. I think you were there, Santiago, and they listened. And we said at that time, you know, they told us, yeah, we'd like to try this out. And then what we then agreed was that you're going to try this out. It may have worked in Mexico, but man, I know Manila and the Philippines, and I'm not exactly sure it would work there. But what you had to do is build in your own impact evaluation so that you can have a feedback mechanism that will make sure that the context is right. So I think Santiago is right. The other is that for many of these impact evaluations, most of the prescriptions about design should be about the project itself, and for the reason that Jack mentioned, that in the World Bank, countries put in some of their money invariably in the impact evaluation. They're borrowing money from us or getting grants, but it's their money.
And for that reason, they want to know what's in it for us. How are we going to improve our projects? So maybe this goes to Lant's second part of the talk, but that it's useful from that point of view, even if you have concerns with self-evaluation. The third and last point that I wanted to make is on this fascinating discussion in Lant's paper about, I guess it's experiential evaluation, which I think is fascinating. I think that just two things, and these are two real questions, Lant. Do you think that independent evaluation would have a role in this? Because if units like IEG or your unit, Cheryl, are involved in evaluating during the experience, can we then, at the end of the process, independently make a statement? And if so, what are ways to ensure that there's no conflict of interest? And I really love your views about that, because if you're going to be the next technology that will ramp up to the peak of inflated expectations, we want in on this business.
I'm going to open up to questions in about 2 minutes. First, I want to go back to Santiago and give him a chance, because you were the first to speak. If you wanted to say a few words, especially because we're in an IDB audience, about IDB's work in this area, I mean, I'm reminded, I want to take my hat off as the independent evaluator, and just a personal question. I'm reminded we work a lot on the development effectiveness matrix, which is required of every single project that goes to the board at IDB. And their rating, you have to get a certain score. And in terms of the types of evaluation, the highest score goes to an RCT. So given what we're having here, you know, maybe we want to think about that again. I mean, I think the message of this is, and I'm not against RCTs, but I think this raises questions for all of us. And I think the question, I mean, if I had to have a one-sentence summary of the message, it's learning what works as you implement. I think that's what you have put in your me, which is, by the way, monitoring little e and big E, so it's not just me, but, and it's a great paper, by the way, this paper on me. It's all about me. But it really is learning what works as you implement on the ground and correcting as you go as really the message. Now, it doesn't refer to counterfactuals and all of the other things that you learn, you know, academically about attribution and causation and how you test these kinds of things. But I wanted to give Santiago a chance to say a few words, if you wanted, about kind of your perspective on IDB's evaluation and where it's going. But, you know, I realize this could be a long speech, but just a few minutes at least, because I do want to then open up and have some minutes for questions from the audience.
So I think we need to make a sharp distinction, a really sharp distinction between the need for evaluation on the one hand and the techniques that are being used for that evaluation on the other hand. I am a strong believer in the need for evaluation. I'm an agnostic practitioner of the techniques that you apply for those evaluations. I think that the bank should try to measure whether in fact its programs are working or not working, and the techniques that it uses to measure should be applied depending on the circumstances. I also think that you can learn from those evaluations, but I would agree with Lant that you can learn from many evaluations that don't have a randomized control trial, and you can also learn the wrong things from evaluations that have randomized controls and export that knowledge into a context in which that knowledge is not being done. So not to make a long, I mean, sort of agnostic, pragmatic, and sort of pick and choose. If you want to summarize my views in one sentence, is don't put all your eggs in one basket.
So okay. You want to say a few words?
Yeah, I do want to make sort of 2 points. One is, I think the things we don't want to confuse impact evaluation, which is testing one part of the causal chain of a project. I mean, in the sense that when we say, I'm going to build a school, and then there's going to be a teacher in the school, and then there's going to be books in school, and then that will attract the child to come, and then the child will learn something. You know, the ultimate objective is a child with a better life in the future because of the school building, and there are many steps in the causal chain, and oftentimes what we're confused in impact evaluation, which is all the way from input to the outcome on the intended beneficiary, but there's lots of other steps, and many projects fail not because they have a wrong causal theory from the production of the output to the outcome. It's not as if they're wrong as if we had an attractive school that taught kids something, kids would be better off. That isn't the part of the causal chain that's wrong, but it's that, gee, building the school, we didn't then integrate it into a plan to staff the school, or we didn't staff it, So the evaluation process is, and I want to say is part of a learning process, and when we ask ourselves organizationally, and I think Jack's point was very deep, which is organizationally we want to ask ourselves, where in this causal chain do we need to learn? And then devise a learning strategy that's addressing what we need to know, of which impact evaluation may only end up being a small, and maybe not even 10%, but maybe about 10%, whereas the experiential learning during the course of the project may actually be a much bigger deal that's currently ignored in favor of the black box input to output. Second thing is, I am a big disbeliever in independent evaluation in the following sense. Is that if I go to the Pope, and I say, I used this analogy yesterday, but anyway, if I go to the Pope and I say, we're going to assemble a team of independent investigators, and they are going to be able to answer precisely the question of whether bingo on Tuesday or bingo on Thursday increases the faith of your Catholic adherents and their attendance at Sunday services. I'm like, great. I'm anxious to learn about that. And if they say, this is, by the way, going to be carried out by an independent panel, such that once you authorize it, you won't have any control over what they find, I like bingo Tuesday, bingo Thursday, yeah, let them say what they want to say. If we come and say, we're going to assemble an independent evaluator who is going to scientifically and conclusively prove one way or another whether petitionary prayer works, and once you authorize this study that will produce conclusive results that will be persuasive both to Catholics and non-Catholics, you will have no control over the study or the dissemination of its findings. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to put any core existential beliefs on which my organization hinges at the risk of having a person not in my control, be destructive to my organizational purposes. So, this myth that we can have kind of exclusively arm's length relationships and still induce the cooperation of people who want to learn is one of the tensions inside here, and I think we need to be more honest about, how much we're really helping them and how much, we're there to tell them that they were wrong. And if evaluation is perceived as an independent exercise that is going to be produced by powers external to the organization to give yay, nay on funding, we can expect what we often see. I mean, of the 460 randomized control trials planned by the bank, my guess is more than half of them will fail to complete because the countries will withdraw their cooperation, because they were never really on board with it. I have lots of students who have worked doing implementation of independent evaluations who the main frustration is that the client doesn't want it, because it's not designed in a way that it's saying, help me learn how to teach these farmers such to improve their yields. And then, by the way, once we have settled on what we think is an attractive way, we can come back and do other impact evaluations. But before we do an impact evaluation, let's get to where we know we are producing a set of sort of inputs that we think at least. So there's these stages, and I would think any organization like the IDB or the World Bank needs to be thinking more coherently about what are the stages at which we're going to do which kind of learning, and what are the things for which we kind of need impact evaluation to do the black box, and how to build the internal experiential learning more as a routine matter of the way in which we implement projects.
I think there's a tension between kind of accountability, evaluation for accountability and evaluation for learning. And a lot of the independent evaluation in these organizations is heavily for accountability to, for the board. Yeah. But it is true, management would not ask our unit to do an evaluation that criticizes them. I mean, that's inherent, that's understandable. So, but just separating the the different functions. Why don't we go to questions? We've got a half an hour, and please go to the mic. I'm sure people will have questions, and just, if you don't mind, go to the mic and just say who you are. And you can direct the question, preferably so we have enough time, just, to one of the panelists, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you. I'm Pablo Barragán. I work at the Social Protection and Health Unit, and I've worked at the Office of Evaluation and at the Office of Strategic Planning, so I've seen a lot of the evaluation work here at the bank. And for Lant, I have some questions. First, in terms of the cost and the external validity, I'm not sure that they're features only of RCTs. I guess you can do other type of evaluations that are more expensive, and that you also have the issue of external validity. I mean, if you do an RCT or you do some other type of evaluation, you might still not be able to claim external validity. I guess the issue about, I honestly haven't read the paper of the Little E, but the issue of learning the implementation, because what you said at the end, as all RCTs are black box evaluations, I guess RCTs might be a way to answer a question, and you can pose a black box question, or you can ask a very specific question, like giving this incentive changes this behavior or not. You don't want to understand exactly why, but if it's a very narrow question, then you can test these change in the project. And I guess, and I think that that's what we're, at least in some areas of the bank, trying to do this kind of rigorous evaluation for the small questions, let's say, in order to learn during the implementation. And what I really also agree, and I think it's very important, is to say, we always say not all projects need impact evaluations, and 10% might be too much. Here we have 30%, and we are happy of saying we have that percent. So it's very easy to say not all projects need to do it, but how, and I don't know if this is maybe for Santiago, how can we go to the board and say, well, this is a project that doesn't need an evaluation, and be able to live with that? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline. I work in Strategic Planning and Development Effectiveness here at IDB, and I'm an MPID 06, actually, one of the batches that missed you. So 3 questions for you. One of them is, you say that next generation M&E systems have to allow for a greater flexibility in implementation. But one of the reasons this whole hype began towards evaluation was that we were able to justify almost anything exposed by saying, I didn't get my targeted outcome, but XYZ happened, and that's really good. Therefore, my project is still a satisfactory project. So how can we safeguard accountability of the development resources while still allowing flexibility in the implementation and learn by doing? That's the first question. The second question is, in a counterfactual world where, we didn't have Esther Duflo, no RCT hype, do you think we would be better off as a development community or not? And the final question is, what do you think about quasi-experimental evaluation? They're a lot cheaper. We can leverage existing administrative systems. So do you think that they're going to go through a similar trough of disillusionment? Or because we can leverage at lower expense, are you more favorably inclined towards those? Thank you.
My question's for Lant Pritchett. I'm Alexis Diamond at IFC. I'm in charge of internal evaluation. And my question is, so what is the experiential evaluation approach? What does it mean to crawl the space? At IFC, we're very interested in this. Do you have in mind the traditional observational toolbox, regression discontinuity, some forms of regression? Do you have in mind just less rigorous RCTs with smaller sample sizes? I'd like to know what that actually means.
One final question. I'm Viviane Azevedo. I work here at the Opportunities for the Majority, a private sector unit. And I want to know the panel's view about impact evaluations on the private sector. They're expensive. The clients are not willing to pay for it, but the bank wants us to do it. So what is your view? Our projects are small in volume. They're not very expensive, but they do require an evaluation, some of them. So just a broader view from everybody. Thank you.
We'll have another round, and then anyone thinks more, but why don't we...
So The thing is the cost issue is intrinsic, because if you want to do an impact evaluation, you need data on a counterfactual group. The counterfactual data is an incremental cost, right? I mean, you have to generate data from people who you are not otherwise engaged with, whereas my point is not about, randomized controlled trials. It's randomized controlled trials as a tool of impact evaluation. So what's a black box is impact evaluation. What little e is in fact bringing randomized control within the project implementation and using the available implementation data that one would normally use in the course of events, like building the causal chain measurement into the project design. So we're going to train some farmers. We think those farmers who we're training are going to change their behavior. We think their behavior change is going to lead them to have higher yields. That's going to lead to higher incomes. Impact evaluation is project training to higher incomes, right? But you can build into the project design assessing whether the farmer's got anything out of the evaluation as an intermediate input in the causal chain. And then you can, if there are 3 different ways of doing farmer training, you can essentially randomize or non-randomize variation within the project. And then you just use it's intrinsically cheaper because you're not having to generate counterfactual data of a non-treatment group. You're using data that you kind of should have been generating anyway had you been performance-oriented, right? So you expand the range of M data to include your intermediate chain, and then you're using the M data in a purposive way to learn about the effectiveness of your project. And this is like incredibly cheaper, because it's mainly, if you do it right ex ante, it's kind of an intrinsic part of project management, as opposed to a separate component we hive off to a group that shows up, does it here, shows up periodically. Now, it's not independent, right? This is built into the intrinsic thing. So this is kind of what I mean by experiential learning, and I do mean much more concern with observational impact and much less concern with rigor about the statistics. So there's pretty compelling evidence that if you just do what works and continue to do what works in an experimental way, you can kind of end up with much better outcomes, even if what works doesn't, in the instance, happen to be statistically significant. So again, the statistical significance is all an academic fetish, whereas if you just try things and like, well, this is working better in this region than that region, let's go with this. So that's what I mean by little e, and there's the paper that sort of describes more what I mean. So I'm not against RCTs. I'm not against the randomization as a tool for learning and identifying precision of effects. I'm just, in fact, when I'm bringing the RCT inside the learning loops, as opposed to being an independent, outside, exclusively impact evaluation learning loop thing. So this is why when the hype plays out and we get into the slope of enlightenment, we're not against the key insights about the difficulty of causal identification, but we're doing it at lower cost, more rapid turnaround, useful to the actual implementers, rather than seeing it exclusively as a technique. And let me say, just so but let me say one thing that answers some questions and dodges others, which is, in my mind, the key transformation of development effectiveness is making our organizations and the organizations we implicitly support in government and the private sector to have a performance orientation to becoming more effective, and encourage them to measure performance, respond to performance, learn about how to get to higher performance, right? That has to be internalized inside both our organizations and their organizations, and it's not leaving the organization as the black box. So I think the norm shift and cultural shift is not that we need more rigorous outside science on impacts, but we've been too complacent about solution-oriented approaches where once the task manager, as Jack was saying, once the task manager spent 2 years designing the project, we have to believe in the project and implement the project as designed, come hell or high water. And that model of design, in the bank, one of the bank's cultural problems for many years was precisely that design is for the smart guys and implementation's for dummies. So all of the like sexiness was getting your project to the board, at which point you looked around for some guy who could like do the procurement and handed it off, right? People laughing like recognize this, right? So it's changing the culture to say, no, actually what should be kind of really, and that worked well as long as we were in the world where implementation really was just a routine, was like delivering the mail, right? We designed the dam, and once the dam was designed, it was a construction issue, but nothing about the design as the dam was intended to change over the 8 years of construction, because boy, once we pour that first load of concrete, we're set, right? Whereas, inside the organizations, we want, dynamic learning together with the client to be like the sexy thing that everybody wants to be doing. We don't want the best and brightest of the IDB involved in independent impact evaluation, because that's the sexy component. We want them involved in working with the clients to help make their organizations more effective at what they're trying to do. Can I go over?
Sure.
But I think there's kind of a semantic issue here. I can see from the academic point of view that people see this, causality discussion and the black box, and you do this and you get this outcome there, and you know what happened in the middle. From the perspective of at least from my perspective of a development bank, that's not really what happens. You design the project, and then you engage with the country. You engage with the country, and the fact that you're doing an evaluation actually increases and enhances the quality of your engagement with the country if they're on. If they're not on, game out. But if they're on, because as the project is evolving, they might want to adjust this, adjust that. They turn out that, we thought about this when we designed it, but it turns out it's not happening. We thought nurses would be very happy to do this, but in fact they're not doing it, so we need to rethink and feed in and adapt. And it generates a huge amount of information triggered by the process of doing it. And that's all welcome. Now, will that dirty up, from an academic perspective, a very clean experiment? Well, la vida es dura. Too bad for the academics, right? I mean, who cares? Well, some academics care, but we don't particularly are worried here at the IDB. At the end is, are you engaging, and are you changing, and are you doing it along the way? So my take on all this is, yes, there was a huge kind of hype, and again, it was provoked by this. The only rigorous way of doing things is by generating RCTs, and that's the only evidence that matters, and everything has to be based on that, which was kind of over-exaggerating, overblown, overdone. But on the ground, so to speak, things were not pushed to that extreme, and in practice, the process of doing it is as valuable as the statistics after you're done.
Jack, I'm wondering if you have any response to the question on the private sector, if any of MCC projects deal with the private sector.
There are two answers to those two questions, no and yes. No, we don't do much evaluation of private sector, but that would never prevent me from providing an answer to the question. So what's the private sector agent that makes the greatest use of randomized controlled trial? Drug companies. And there's another side to drug companies which I've found quite fascinating. I walked into MCC quite willingly. I've got to say, I was complicit in this, with this notion that, yes, we were going to be the world's auditors. We were going to test, were these programs really good, or were they no good at all? There was this independent evaluator role. The independence, there was an attraction to it because we are responsible for the public trust. We're spending taxpayer money, and we want to be able to say these, $500 million compacts that we have with countries, we want to be able to say, did they really bring about the level of economic growth that we claim? So I was a full partner in this. There was a little bit of disbelief there, but there was this notion this is what we were going to do. as we started getting into some of the challenges of implementing impact evaluations, randomized controlled trials, when the implementing partner was not a partner to what we were doing, and we were trying to stay at a nice, safe distance, we started saying, maybe it would be better to try to embed our evaluators into the activity so that we're actually measuring the right things. So we're getting these intermediate outcomes, which are essential parts of the program logic, so that even if it's a total failure, we should at least learn where it broke down along the causal logic. What was the problem? And as we started thinking and pushing in this direction, there came this question, yes, but won't we lose our independence? Won't we lose our ability to provide good auditable records of whether or not the program did what it was supposed to do? And I had to step back and say, wait a minute. When you look at evaluations of drugs, who does the randomized controlled trials? And the reality is, it's the drug companies themselves that do it. They have their own very strict protocols that they adhere to, and these protocols are strictly audited and monitored. And there are lots of parts of it that get fiddled with. But the bottom line is the vast majority of what we're learning from randomized controlled trials is done by the private sector, but it's done by the private sector doing their own evaluations subject to very strict controls. This is not directly applicable, but it does seem to me a relevant thing to keep in mind when we think about these questions.
Just 2 quick points. One is that the evaluation of the evaluations that the World Bank Group, IEG, did, in fact, covered the IFC as well. And there, in fact, they are doing more impact evaluations. But the issue is in the IFC, as it is in the World Bank, is are you prioritizing your scarce resources well and picking where you should in fact be doing evaluations. And one of the concerns is that we're doing evaluations where it's much easier to do impact evaluations and where there's a steady supply of graduate students that will in fact make those a little cheaper. That's in the human resources, the human development area, and less on infrastructure. Just one last point on this. In fact, Lant, IEG does not do a lot of impact evaluation. We do only a couple a year for the very reason that you point out. Most of the impact evaluation is being done in operations with the view, I think, to try to feed that loop into implementation. To do it successfully all the time, I think you're absolutely right that that's a real concern. So I just wanted to make that point.
I'm wondering if we have any other questions? Please. To the mic.
Hello, my name is Dieter Boyerman. I'm an economist in the Caribbean Country Department. Well, until 1 month ago, I was working in Norway. So I would like to start my question giving you the answer of the first question you asked that I couldn't answer because you were presenting, right? So you asked, what would you trust more, right? The effect of class size reduction in Tennessee or a naive estimate of class size reduction in Kenya? So my answer to that would be I would trust the experimental paper of Duflo, Paz, and Kremer in Kenya that show the effects of class reduction and tracking on academic achievement in Kenya, right? So I completely agree with the claims that RCTs or impact evaluation are not externally valid. There is a huge gap in evaluating mechanisms, although it's also a matter of budget, because you with an RCT of a longer term, you could potentially, if you have a model in mind, evaluate mechanisms, and the fact that it's very important to have replicable like interventions. So my question will be, if you have a good evaluation that could be replicable in the right context, wouldn't that be valuable towards a potential scale-up in a successful program? Right?
Hi, Tony Fuge. I'm an internal evaluator for DC-based nonprofit, and I have a question. I'm a big believer of what talking about dynamic learning, learning as we go and inform implementation, taking corrective actions. So there is a big trend toward that in the US nonprofit sector, which is called performance management. It's a beautiful idea. Making it work is hard. We're trying to do that every day in a middle-sized organization. Making it work in an organization the size of the World Bank or the IDB, getting that feedback loop, the information in real time, and making sure you make that information actionable so you can actually tweak implementation. How would you picture that? Thank you.
So I'm not quite sure what, in the end, that question was, but the question is, wouldn't I want an impact evaluation that provided the true answer for the context that everyone believed and adopted? Yeah, great. But you have to have a theory of change of, am I in this situation such that were I to do this impact evaluation, there are people that would pick it up and adopt it. So, you know, if you don't have a willing partner, kind of the idea that exogenously the rigorous evidence is going to change the contextual dynamics, I think, is part of what has been false about this as a theory of change. So yeah, there are lots of environments in which I have a willing partner, and you know, I think Santiago's use of a, you know, experiment in the context of launching a big program was genius, but it was genius because Santiago was a genius. It wasn't that if someone had come to Santiago and said, the Federal Bureau of Mexican Projects demand that you have an impact evaluation, and Santiago hadn't had a clear idea of what he was trying to do, both administratively, technically, and politically with the program, that would have, as an exogenous feature, been enormously valuable. I just don't believe, and we need to get that overall coherent theory of change right. Which leads to the answer to the second question, which is, what the World Bank and the IDB should do is they are support organizations to domestic actors. Right? The IDB is intended to support the government of Bolivia in doing what the government of Bolivia wants to do. So I am not saying, what I am saying is that the IDB and the World Bank should focus on how they act to facilitate a cooperative and productive relationship with their clients, and their clients are the ones that on the ground really need to be learning by doing, and the IDB and World Bank can be more or less helpful in that. So this isn't about how to manage the IDB. The IDB and external support agency management is always a meta question. This is really more about if you were the Ministry of Education of Colombia, or if you were the Minister of Health of Bolivia, and we're trying to solve a problem like, I still have chronic malnutrition of children in a middle-income country, what would I do? I think PDIA and ME&E are tactics and strategies you would use with your domestic organizations to try and mobilize them to develop and implement the capabilities, and you would hope your external partners could be supportive of that, including by providing external resources in a flexible way that would allow you to learn, and by bringing learning from elsewhere, of like, here's what learned. So I think there can be a cooperative relationship. But this isn't about what the World Bank should do or what the IDB should do. It's first and foremost about what's our theory of changes, what's going to lead to development on the ground, and how can these external agencies be supportive of that. And in that sense, let me get back to the question that you might have thought I was ducking. The world would have been a better place without this fad. Because the fad not only has been seen as being generated on the basis that development was a failure because we weren't doing enough rigorous evaluation, which is false, it was also premised on the basis that external actors could play a big role, which is false, and was also premised on the notion that the activities that can generate the statistical power to do an RCT are the key development activities, which is false. All of which has biased the development field in ways that we essentially, Latin America had a lost decade of growth, development economics has had a lost decade of intellectual growth.
I'm going to close there, but I do want to say one thing. Sorry, we have time. I want to say one thing, which is to support this, and I am so glad Lant is teaching. Because we have a lot of young people coming into OVE who have masters in economics. I'd say 90% of them want to do impact evaluation. And many of them have told me that's the only legitimate thing that should be called evaluation. And I really have found that sad. And I'm very glad that you're teaching, and that hopefully we will have a group come in that can see the way that Santiago put it. You need evaluation. There's lots of ways to do evaluation. You're agnostic on the approach because the context matters. One size doesn't fit all. It's often qualitative. It's often implementation evaluation. Those are all very valid things. It depends on the context. It depends what's needed. There's been way too much emphasis on rigorous impact evaluation, quote unquote, as if everything else is not rigorous. I think of some of my colleagues at ECG who get so angry when they heard the word rigorous, right? Because it's ridiculous, but we have distorted the language to say it's only certain things are rigorous and everything else is not rigorous. But we need to think in IDB, in the World Bank, about how we're doing projects. This is all about embedding evaluation and what's the most useful way to spend our scarce resources and the client's scarce resources in what we're asking them to do in evaluation. And we are probably not getting it right yet, but I hope this has been a useful discussion for all of us to think about what we're asking in our own projects, what we're embedding in our projects, and how we self-evaluate our own projects as to whether we've done the right thing or not. So I thank you all very much. I certainly want to thank Lant, Manny, Santiago, Jack.